This video is going to focus on some of the key concepts and theories underpinning the development of a disciplinary community and how you can involve a student through assessment in becoming part of that community. So the key things underpinning the concept of a disciplinary community are sociocultural models of learning. Now we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in the module that focuses on subdimension AF3, activities of peer assessment and peer feedback, but we're going to talk about some of those elements relating to disciplines within this particular video. A key concept as to how disciplinary communities and learning communities work is underpinned by the idea of personal learning networks. So everyone has a network of sources of information around them that they use when they need to find out how to do things, find out information, or need help or support. Those could be people, they could be humans, it could be a certain type of technology such as the internet or YouTube or generative AI or those sorts of opportunities. It could be actions that you're involved with or activities that you're part of, and also it's about social relationships as well. So there are people and groups that can support you in your learning and your development. The important thing about personal learning networks is they interact with each other, they overlap. So one person's personal learning network might involve another person, and that other person's personal learning network might involve that first person in a mutualistic arrangement. That leads very closely to the concept of learning communities. So disciplinary communities are ways of thinking about a learning community within a particular concept of a discipline or a concept of a profession. So this model on the right, which comes from Powerful Learning Communities, a book by Lenning and colleagues from 2013, talks about there being three types of communities involved in learning community concepts. So there's a student learning community or a learner learning community, which has groups of students that are working towards a similar learning goal. It could be groups of students within a module or a course. It could be groups of students who just happen to be studying together. It could be a group of students who happen to live together. Then there's a professional learning community, so that's the community of the discipline. So that's professionals within that discipline, a learning community of lawyers or a learning community of doctors or a learning community of historians or philosophers or chemists or engineers. And then there's learning organisations, which are professional organisations that support professional activities within a particular discipline. Those often have regulatory roles within the educational elements of that disciplinary community. So with student learning communities, the way in which those communities interact with each other are often small study groups or seminar groups or project groups. And they also interact through social media contacts as well. So either a virtual learning environment or social media such as Facebook or WhatsApp or similar sort of mechanisms like that. And it can be groups working on a collaborative task. With the professional learning communities, it's a bit more formal. So there are plenary meetings of academic staff, for example, or there could be an online or an email or a letter-based or a magazine-based community within that particular discipline. And you then maybe have elements of that that are involved in teaching support and professional development within that discipline. Within learning organisations, it's a larger construct again, so it could be things like conferences, annual meetings, general meetings, and so on. Usually student learning communities are fairly short-lived. They're either within a particular task, within a particular module or course, or within a particular degree course. So it's the duration of the students being in that position where they need to rely on each other. Professional learning communities and learning organisations tend to last for longer, although the components of that, the people who are involved in those communities, might change. They're likely to be larger communities that stay for a longer period of time. But regardless of the length of those learning communities, there's either short-term, long-term, or very brief interactions between members of that learning community. That concept links very closely with Lev and Wenger's idea of communities of practice. This definition here comes from 2015 paper by Wenger-Trainer and Wenger-Trainer, that communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something that they do, and they learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. And they posit that a community of practice, in its rawest sense, needs to have three key factors. Firstly, a domain, which is an area of interest that defines those members. It could be being a healthcare professional, or being a doctor, or being a historian, or being an archaeologist, or being an engineer, or being faculty within or staff within a particular faculty, or staff within a particular department, or students within a particular environment or a particular course. There needs to be evidence of community, so evidence that there's a relationship and frequent interactions within the members of that group. They share experiences, they share perceptions, they share understandings, and they support each other. And finally, there needs to be a common practice between them. So a sustained communal activity which develops and changes and modifies over time as the members of that community interact with each other. So those are communities of practice, and that's an important concept underpinning any sort of disciplinary community. As an element of that communities of practice theory, Wenger proposed an idea known as legitimate peripheral participation. The idea of that's sort of shown in this diagram on the right hand side, which is trying to show a community of practice of academics within a particular discipline. So what legitimate peripheral participation posits is there are layers within a community of practice. So at the very, very centre of that community of practice is the real expert, the internationally renowned professor in this case, or it could be the award-winning or internationally renowned surgeon in a medical team, for example. So in an academic environment, at the centre of that community of practice are the international renowned professors. They're the ones who are really driving that discipline forward, coming up with new ideas, coming up with new ways of doing and ways of being and ways of thinking. Around those are people who have maybe a slightly lesser reputation, slightly lesser impact, so lecturers or people who have that sort of established national research activity. Outside of those are people who are training to be that sort of independent leader, so postdoctoral research fellows or independent researchers. Outside of that are postgraduate students, either masters or doctoral students, who are learning to be members of that discipline in a really focused way. They're learning to be researchers, they're learning to be independent members of that discipline. Outside of that, you have undergraduate students who are just starting on that journey within that discipline. And outside of that, you have arguably primary, secondary school level learners who are just starting to understand elements of that discipline. They're just starting to study biology or history or philosophy or chemistry or literature or mathematics. The key thing about legitimate peripheral participation is that there's interactions between those levels. So the people towards the outside interact with the people that are more central, and through that they gain insights and they gain currency within that discipline, within that community of practice, and get themselves ever more central towards that expert point within the centre of that community of practice. So those different layers, those different groups of people within the community interact with each other and become increasingly more centralised, so that they eventually will become the experts who are supporting the people peripheral to them. Now, the key thing to think about is how can we use assessment to drive the development of a learning community? How can assessment help a learner become a central part of that community of practice, that learning community, that disciplinary community? The key thing with that is the need for authentic assessments which align very closely with the conventions of that particular discipline or that particular community of practice. So assessments that help enculturalise the learner within that particular discipline. We'll focus more on these types of authentic and meaningful assessments in the module that focuses on sub-dimension AD2, which is the provision of meaningful and authentic assessments within assessment design.